After years studying exercise scientists, I found something that genuinely surprised me. Strength training isn't just one option among many for staying healthy. According to almost everyone I spoke with, it might be the single most underrated, most consistently overlooked pillar of long-term health that exists, more predictive of how long you live and how well you live than almost anything else within your control. And most of us have been quietly ignoring it our entire lives in favor of things that feel like they should matter more, but don't, at least not to the same degree. I want to walk you through exactly how I arrived at that conclusion, because it wasn't a single study or a single conversation. It built slowly across dozens of conversations with exercise physiologists, geriatricians, and researchers who study aging at the cellular level. And what struck me most was how consistently they all arrived at the same underlying point, even when they came from completely different corners of the field. Almost every single one of them, at some point in the conversation, said some version of the same sentence. If I could only recommend one form of exercise to someone who wanted to live a long, healthy, independent life, it would be strength training, not cardio, not stretching, not any of the things most people instinctively reach for first. Let me start with the thing that reframed the entire subject for me, because I think it's the single most important idea in everything I learned. Most of us think about muscle in terms of appearance, something related to looking a certain way, relevant mainly to athletes or people who want to look a certain way at the beach. What I learned is that muscle tissue is one of the most metabolically active, functionally important tissues in your entire body, and it's declining on a schedule in almost everyone, starting far earlier than most people realize. Multiple researchers describe the same pattern. After around your 30s, without deliberate intervention, the average adult begins losing a measurable percentage of their muscle mass every decade, a process called sarcopenia, and that loss tends to accelerate as you move further into your 50s, 60s, and beyond. This isn't a niche concern, relevant only to elderly people already showing signs of frailty. It's a slow, largely invisible process that begins decades before most people ever think to address it, and by the time it becomes visible in reduced strength, reduced mobility, and increased risk of falls, a meaningful amount of the damage has already been done. Here's the part that actually made this click for me as something urgent rather than simply interesting. Several geriatricians I spoke with described muscle mass and strength, particularly grip strength and lower body strength, as being among the single strongest predictors they have of whether an older adult will remain independent, able to live in their own home, able to get up from a chair unassisted, able to recover from a fall or an illness, versus requiring long-term assisted care. One researcher put it in a way I haven't been able to forget. She said, "We spend enormous amounts of cultural energy worrying about cardiovascular health, and rightly so, but we have almost no cultural conversation about the fact that the ability to stand up from the floor without using your hands, a simple functional movement most people can do without thinking about it in their 20s, becomes a genuine predictor of mortality risk in older age, specifically because it reflects the underlying strength and muscle mass that so much of independent living quietly depends on." I want to walk through the specific mechanisms researchers described to me, because I think understanding why muscle matters this much is more useful than simply being told that it does. The first mechanism is metabolic. Muscle tissue is one of the primary places in your body where glucose, the sugar from the food you eat, gets taken up and used for energy. Multiple researchers described skeletal muscle as functioning almost like a metabolic sponge, and the more muscle mass you carry, generally speaking, the better your body tends to be at managing blood sugar and insulin sensitivity overall. As muscle mass declines with age, that metabolic sponge shrinks, which several researchers connected directly to the rising rates of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes seen as people get older, a connection that gets far less public attention than diet alone, despite being, according to several of the people I spoke with, at least as significant a factor. The second mechanism is skeletal. Bone density and muscle mass are deeply interconnected, because the mechanical stress placed on bone during resistance exercise is one of the primary signals your body uses to maintain, and in some cases even rebuild, bone density over time. Several researchers pointed out that the same strength training that builds muscle simultaneously works to protect against osteoporosis, and that this dual benefit is particularly important for women after menopause, when the natural decline in bone density can accelerate significantly, making resistance training one of the few interventions shown to meaningfully counteract that specific accelerated risk. The third mechanism, and this is the one that surprised me the most, has to do with your immune system and your overall resilience during illness or injury. Several researchers described muscle tissue as functioning as a kind of metabolic and protein reserve that your body draws on during periods of significant physical stress, illness, surgery, or injury recovery. Someone entering a hospital stay or a serious illness with a larger reserve of muscle mass, according to multiple studies referenced in these conversations, tends to have measurably better outcomes and faster recoveries than someone entering that same illness with very little muscle reserve to draw on. One physician described this in stark terms. Muscle mass, she said, is essentially a bank account you're drawing from during any period of serious physical stress, and a huge number of people are entering their 60s, 70s, and 80s with an account that's already nearly empty without ever having been told that account existed in the first place. The fourth mechanism is about mortality risk directly, and this is the piece that came up most often in terms of actual data. Multiple large population studies referenced by the researchers I spoke with have found a consistent, strong relationship between measures of muscular strength, particularly grip strength as an easily measurable proxy, and overall mortality risk, independent of cardiovascular fitness. That's a genuinely important distinction because it means strength appears to be predicting something about your overall health and resilience that isn't simply explained away by whether or not someone also does cardio. Several researchers describe this relationship as one of the most consistently replicated findings across large, long-term studies of aging populations, and yet one of the least discussed in mainstream conversations about health, which still tend to center almost entirely on cardiovascular exercise and diet. I want to talk now about why strength training has ended up so underweighted in the popular conversation around health, because I think understanding the reason is almost as useful as understanding the science itself. Several researchers pointed to a few overlapping explanations. Cardiovascular exercise has a much longer history of public health messaging behind it, tied to decades of research specifically on heart disease, which remains the leading cause of death in many countries, giving it an enormous head start in public awareness. Strength training, meanwhile, has historically been culturally associated with a narrow subset of people, bodybuilders, athletes, gym enthusiasts, in a way that made it feel irrelevant or intimidating to the average person simply trying to stay healthy. And several researchers pointed out that some of the most important research connecting muscle mass to long-term health outcomes and mortality is relatively recent compared to the decades of cardiovascular research that came before it, meaning public health messaging simply hasn't caught up yet to what the more recent evidence actually shows. I remember one conversation in particular that made all of this feel less abstract to me. I was speaking with an exercise physiologist who spends a significant amount of her time working specifically with older adults, and she described a pattern she sees constantly in her clinic. People come to her in their 60s or 70s, often after a fall, or after noticing they can no longer easily get up from a low chair, or carry groceries up a flight of stairs the way they used to, treating this decline as an inevitable, unavoidable part of getting older. And she said the thing she finds most frustrating and most hopeful at the same time is that in the vast majority of these cases, a substantial amount of that decline is not actually an unavoidable feature of aging itself. It's the accumulated result of decades of a specific tissue, skeletal muscle, being almost completely neglected, and it responds often remarkably well, even when strength training is introduced for the very first time later in life. She described working with patients in their 70s and 80s who, after a structured strength training program, regained enough strength and function to return to activities they had assumed were permanently gone, not because muscle doesn't decline with age, but because the body's capacity to respond to resistance training by building new muscle and strength remains present at a meaningful level much later into life than most people assume. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to overstate this into a claim that strength training reverses aging entirely, or that starting later completely erases decades of decline. What researchers were consistently clear about is something more precise and, I think, more genuinely useful. The earlier you start building and maintaining muscle mass, the larger the reserve you carry into older age, but meaningful, measurable benefit from strength training is available at essentially any age, including very advanced age, which makes it almost uniquely valuable compared to some other health interventions that show sharply diminishing returns the later in life you begin them. I also want to address something that came up repeatedly, because I think it's one of the most common misconceptions standing between people and actually doing this. Several researchers push back directly against the idea that strength training requires a serious commitment to heavy lifting, complex gym equipment, or a bodybuilder-style routine to produce meaningful benefit. What the research actually shows, according to multiple physiologists I spoke with, is that even relatively modest amounts of resistance training, done consistently, 2 to 3 sessions a week, using bodyweight resistance bands or moderate weights, produce significant measurable improvements in strength, muscle mass, and the associated metabolic and skeletal benefits I've described. The threshold for meaningful benefit, in other words, is considerably lower than most people assume, which means the barrier standing between most people and this specific health benefit isn't really about capacity. It's almost entirely about awareness and habit. I want to bring in one more thread here, because it surprised me and I think it deserves real attention. Several researchers described a specific concern related to a form of weight loss that's become extremely common in recent years, achieved primarily through significant calorie restriction or newer weight loss medications without a deliberate strength training component alongside it. Several physiologists pointed out that a meaningful share of weight lost through these methods, if not paired with resistance training, can come from muscle tissue rather than exclusively from fat, meaning someone can end up lighter on a scale while simultaneously ending up with a smaller, weaker muscular reserve than before, precisely the opposite of what's protective for long-term health. This was described to me as an increasingly urgent, under-discussed public health concern, given how rapidly these newer weight loss approaches have grown in popularity. And several researchers were emphatic that anyone pursuing significant weight loss through any method should be pairing it with deliberate strength training, specifically to protect the muscle mass that's otherwise at real risk of being lost alongside the fat. I want to bring all of this together now, because I think there's a single unifying idea underneath everything I've described. We have spent decades treating muscle, strength, and the simple act of lifting something heavy on a regular basis as a lifestyle choice, relevant mainly to a specific subset of people who enjoy that kind of exercise. What the actual science overwhelmingly suggests is that maintaining muscle mass and strength is closer to a foundational, universal requirement for long-term health and independence, on par with, and in some specific ways more predictive than the cardiovascular exercise most of us have been taught to prioritize first. It's not a niche interest. It's closer to basic maintenance for the specific tissue your future independence is going to depend on. So let me try to turn this into something you can actually use, because I don't want to leave you with just an interesting set of facts and no clear direction. Here's what I've come to believe, after everything I've learned, about how to actually put this into practice. First, if strength training isn't currently part of your routine at all, treat starting it, even in a small, modest way, as at least as high a health priority as anything else you're currently doing, rather than as an optional extra to add once everything else is handled. 2 to 3 sessions a week, working the major muscle groups, using whatever equipment or resistance is accessible and appropriate for you, is enough to begin producing real, measurable benefit. Second, if you're currently losing weight through calorie restriction or medication, make resistance training a deliberate, non-negotiable part of that process, specifically to protect your muscle mass while you lose fat, rather than treating exercise as a separate, optional consideration from the weight loss itself. Third, if you're already in your later years or supporting a parent or older relative who is, don't assume declining strength and mobility is simply an unavoidable, unchangeable feature of aging. Several researchers were genuinely emphatic that meaningful improvement remains possible at essentially any age, and that the earlier a structured strength program begins, even later in life, the more function and independence it tends to help preserve or restore. Fourth, pay attention to functional strength specifically, not just how you look or how much weight you can lift in an abstract sense. Being able to comfortably get up from the floor, carry groceries, climb stairs without strain, are the actual practical markers several researchers pointed to as being most predictive of long-term independence, more than any specific number on a barbell. Fifth, If you're already doing cardiovascular exercise regularly and feel that's covering your bases, understand that it isn't a substitute for strength training, according to the research. The two appear to protect against genuinely different things, and several researchers were clear that ideally, both belong in a well-rounded routine, rather than one replacing the need for the other entirely. I want to end with something one of the geriatricians said to me near the end of a long conversation that has genuinely changed how I think about my own exercise habits since. She said, "We've built an entire culture around chasing extra years of life, longevity as a headline number, while paying comparatively little attention to whether those extra years are actually independent, mobile, and genuinely livable, rather than years spent increasingly reliant on others for basic tasks." She said if she had to summarize the single most important, most underappreciated lever available for making sure those extra years are actually good ones, it wouldn't be a supplement or a diet or any of the things that dominate most conversations about longevity. It would be the simple, unglamorous act of regularly asking your muscles to do something hard, consistently, for the rest of your life, starting today, regardless of your current age, because the muscle you build or preserve now is, quite literally, the reserve your future self is going to be drawing from, whether you've thought about it that way before or not.